You're on.
Very good. Tonight's lesson is going to be a little bit different in the way that we approach the scriptures than we've done in the previous books of Leviticus. I'm calling this lesson tonight Punishments, Perfections, Prophecies, Power, and Paradoxes. Finding grace in the midst of God's judgment. We'll follow the same format. We'll have the study first, and then we'll have the discussion group discussion questions relating to what we study. And we're going to focus on 3 more chapters in the book of Leviticus. We left off last time we got together with chapter 19, and then we are now going into the chapters 20, 21, and 22. One of the difficult parts of doing this lesson is a lot of the laws that are discussed in these chapters are laws that we already discussed when we discussed chapters 17, 18, and 19. And so without going through repetitive statements about what these laws are, I took it in a little bit of a different direction. When we studied last, we talked about the laws that God gave to his people so that they could maintain their worship and their fellowship with God. God called Israelite to be a holy people, and he called them so that he could be in fellowship in their midst. And so what we always are dealing with when we're dealing with the Israelites in the wilderness is the Israelites in the presence of God, or God in the presence of the Israelites through the tabernacle and the Holy of Holies. We went from the relationship that the Israelites had with horizontally with or vertically with God, and then he went to the laws dealing with how they deal with each other in their family relations, focusing on how improper sexual relations outside God's intended plan for sexual relations between a husband and wife, exclusive in the bonds of marriage, how if you've deviated from that in any form, that ruined the family relationship. It ruined, it expanded out to ruining the community. And then in chapter 19, we talked about the laws which God gave to the Israelites that really said obedience to the 10 Commandments and elaborating on what it means to obey the 10 Commandments enabled them to imitate God's holiness so that they could keep their relationship and fellowship with God and keep peace and harmony in their community. And so that was a big picture that we got out of all the specific laws that God gave. When we go into chapters 20, 21, and 22, a lot of these, like I said before, are laws that God already discussed and told the Israelites in the previous chapters. It's still part of what we've referred to at last discussion as the Holiness Code, which really covers chapter 17 of Leviticus to chapters 26. What we're going to do differently, instead of focusing exclusively on the parts of these 3 chapters, we're going to look at how these 3 chapters in the book of Leviticus really create what I call the great paradox between the Old Testament and the New Testament. We're going to talk about in the first chapter, the first part of what we're going to talk about tonight in chapter 20, we're going to talk about the punishments that God imposed on the Israelites for violation of the things that we already talked about in chapter 17 through chapter 19. And we're going to find that a lot of these punishments are pretty severe. They're what we'd call today capital punishments, punishments which would be punishable by death for sins. We're also going to talk about in chapters 20 and 21 about the perfections that God requires of the priest and who is a high priest, and the perfections that he requires for the sacrifices. So the 3 chapters in quick summary form are the chapter dealing with punishments, chapter 20, the chapters dealing with perfections of the priesthood, chapters 21, and the perfections of the sacrifices, chapter 22. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through what would be the content extrapolated from these 3 chapters, but then we're going to get into this question of the paradoxes, and we'll define what a paradox is. When we'll talk about the paradoxes, and hopefully you'll be blessed by the discussion. In chapter 20, speaking through Moses, God emphasized the seriousness of various capital punishment sins, specifying the punishments which were to be imposed for the most serious or treasonous offenses. If you remember, this is a theocracy. It's a God-led kingdom, and God demanded holiness from his people. If you violated God's commands, it was treated as treason. It was treated as apostasy or disobedience to God himself. So you may have mistreated somebody else in the community. You may have defiled one of God's sacrifices, but that was an offense against God. Well, in chapter 20, God tells the punishments for these things. For instance, it starts out with making sacrifices to and worshiping the pagan god Molech. Remember, we covered that back in the earlier chapters. It was a death penalty, or exile, being permanently cut off from your people. Consulting with spiritualists or mediums was also a death penalty offense. Cursing the parents was a death penalty or being cut off. You know, God took very seriously children that were disobedient or cursing to their parents. The reason is because the family structure of the Israelites in the wilderness was critical to the whole operation of the community. As the family went, so did the community. If the family fell apart, then the community fell apart. We're seeing some of that in our country today. But the cursing of parents was, the parents were supposed to give the teachings of God, the laws of God, passing them on to the next generation. And we can see in some of the scriptures where we're told to wake up talking about the laws of God and worshiping God, and to walk in the pathways talking about and worshiping God. It's supposed to be part of the daily lives. This came from the parents. And when the kids rejected the parents' teaching, they were rejecting God, and it was a capital offense. And then we have engaging in the detestable sexual relations. And this was also a death penalty or being cut off type of an offense. And we talked about all the different improper sexual relations in the last lesson, where we talked about whether there's sexual relationships outside of marriage, sexual relationships with close family members, sexual relationships with people of the same sex or with animals. All homosexuality, bestiality, all these things were detestable to the Lord. And anybody that reads the Bible that says that homosexuality is not an offense to God is not reading the Bible. So anyway, that was an offense that required the death penalty or being cut off from the congregation of the people. And then the chapter 20 concludes with living their lives according to the unclean customs of the pagan nations, which God promised to drive out from the promised land. If you remember, God held back from ordering the Israelites to destroy all the Canaanites, all the different peoples in the Canaan, until their sin had reached its fruition. Sodom, Gomorrah, it's when the whole town was full up with sin that God finally imposed his punishment. And he said, if you practice the same thing that the people that are currently living in the land that I'm going to drive out so that it will become the land of milk and honey for you, then you're going to receive the same punishment that I gave to them. Your sin is going to cause a defilement of the land, and I will drive you out of the land. And so he said, don't follow the practices of these pagan nations that are in the land that I'm going to give to you. In chapter 21, speaking through Moses, God established the perfections for the priests and how the priests, and specifically the high priest, were to live out their lives. Specifically for all the priests, God restricted them from making themselves ceremonially unclean by mourning or commingling or coming close with the corpses of any people who died. The only exceptions for the priests were very close family members, parents, male children, spouses, and female children that were still living in the home or had returned to the home because of the death of a husband spouse or a divorce of a husband spouse, where now the female daughter was back under the household of the priest. For the high priest, it was even more restrictive. He could only show mourning with respect to his sons and unmarried daughters and presumably his spouse. He couldn't even do that for his parents. The idea was is that association with a corpse and death really represented sin in the Israelite community. And so being in contact with the corpse and mourning for the dead person that's not a close relative was something that God did not want the priest to be engaged in, because he wanted him to be focused on God and the blessings of God. Now, for all the priests, God forbade them from engaging in any pagan practices to show grief or mourning. The pagans would tattoo themselves. They would tear their clothes. They would shave their hair off, or they cut their beards. God said, I don't want you to follow those pagan practices. You're a priest, look like a priest, stay like a priest, and don't follow these practices in mourning for the dead. For all the priests, God forbade them from marrying women defiled by prostitution or by divorce. For the high priest, God required the high priest to marry only a virgin from the same tribe of Levites, and forbade the high priest from marrying a widow or a woman defiled by prostitution. God wanted the spouse of the high priest to be as excuse me, ceremonially pure and clean as the high priest himself. And then the most interesting part of chapter 21 on the perfections of the priest. For any of the priests who were to come into the sanctuary, the tabernacle, to offer sacrifices to the Lord, whether in the outer courts or in the holies or the most holy for the high priest, they had to be without any physical defects whatsoever. They couldn't be blind, lame, disfigured, deformed, crippled, hunchbacked, dwarfed, or had any defects in eye or festering or running sores or damaged testicles. They had to be specimens of health. It reminded me of the short time I spent in Korea, where they only wanted at the demilitarized zone American soldiers who were above us. I think it was above 5'8" or something, because they always wanted to show the specimens of the American soldier being bigger than the Korean soldier. They wanted to look like they were soldiers, more powerful. Well, that's kind of the same concept that God has here. He wanted, if these priests that were going to minister to God needed to look and represent God in what God's intended purpose of perfection. And so it didn't mean that the ones that had these deformities weren't able to eat at the priest's tables or share in the sacrifices. They just couldn't serve in God's temple, making sacrifices to God without meeting these perfection requirements. In chapter 22, speaking through Moses, God specified how the priests were required to protect themselves and the sacrifices they offer to God from profaning the Lord or from becoming ceremonially unclean. In other words, the priests were looked at to maintain the holiness or the perfections of God's sacrifices. They were told to do so by avoiding any kind of infectious skin disease, defiling bodily discharges, or coming in contact with unclean animals, including any animal dead or torn by wild animals. In other words, they're supposed to keep their ceremonial cleanliness by avoiding in contact with what God considered to be unclean. It also required them, if they did come in contact with any of these defiling or unclean animals, they were required to ceremonially cleanse themselves. And they did this by bathing and then waiting until sundown before eating or consuming any of the holy food of God that was given in the sacrifices made at the tabernacle. The reason for the waiting until sundown is for them to reflect upon the defilement and the holiness of God. And so they took the bath to ritually clean themselves, and then they internally went through the process of recognizing God's holiness. And in the evening, they could be restored to cleanliness so that they can share in the foods of sacrifice. It also precluded any unauthorized person from eating any of the sacrifices authorized by God. The priest priests in their household may have people that are not authorized to eat the sacrifices that are holy. And so it was the duty of the priest to prevent that from happening. And if somebody by accident or by purpose did that, then he had to make a restitution offering that basically added a fifth to restore the offering to God to atone for the sacrifice that he was wrongful in eating. Only the priest and his immediate family members, including those that the priest hires for service as a slave. Now, that doesn't mean the Bible endorsed slavery. Slavery was for a period of only 7 years, and it was for a person to earn their way out of debt with in an obligation. But those were the members of the household that could eat sacrifices that were made and offered to God in the tabernacle. God also required, and this is parallel to the perfections required of the priest, these are the perfections required of the sacrifices. It required all burnt and free will vow offerings to the Lord to be without any physical defects. These animals that were offered to sacrifice could not be blind, injured, maimed, deformed, stunted, or any animal offered in sacrifice couldn't have any warts or festering or running sores. In other words, the sacrifice had to be unblemished or spiritually and ritually perfect. Now, why these perfections to the priests and these perfections required of the sacrifices? They point towards Jesus as the perfect sacrifice and to Jesus as the perfect priest. They all point to what Jesus ultimately accomplishes. Now that we've covered these 3 chapters in Leviticus in a very quick way, I really want to get into the focus of tonight's lesson, and that is it's from these chapters in Leviticus that the non-believer are those who superficially or casually read the Bible, reach the conclusion that the Bible is not true because it's full of inconsistencies or paradoxes. Have you ever heard that? There's so many inconsistencies in the Bibles, how can you believe it? Just can't be true. A paradox is either a statement that appears to be inconsistent by itself, or where one or more statements, when positioned side by side, appear to be inconsistent. A virgin having a child, that's a statement that's internally inconsistent in human thought. How can a virgin have a child? An example of the Old Testament of a paradox where 2 statements side by side cannot both be true at the same time is really an example of that would be, well, where did Jesus come from? Well, in the book of Micah, it was prophesied that Jesus would come from Bethlehem, Micah 5:2. Yet in the book of Hosea, it was prophesied that God would call his son, the Messiah, out of Egypt. And then in the New Testament, Jesus is referred to as the Messiah as a Nazarene. He came from Nazareth. So you have 3 statements. The Messiah comes from Bethlehem, the Messiah comes from Egypt, or the Messiah comes from Nazareth. And how can one person, one human being, come from 3 different places? It's a paradox. It's internally inconsistent. The resolution of these inconsistencies or these paradoxes is important because it all points to Jesus. Only Jesus really resolves all these different paradoxes that are in the Old Testament. So let's get to the paradox, the big picture paradox that applies to these 3 chapters of Leviticus we just discussed. The overriding paradox from these 3 chapters of Leviticus is stated in various ways. Is the God of the Old Testament, who punished sin by death or by cutting his people off from his promises, the same God of forgiveness or grace in the New Testament? Have you ever heard that one? Or did God change from being a mean, wrathful, and strict dispenser of death in the Old Testament to a loving and forgiving Father in the New Testament? Well, we know from Scripture that God doesn't change. He's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And yet he has different attributes. Sometimes these chapters in Leviticus dealing with the punishments that God imposed for punishment of sin just aren't easy to reconcile to the grace of God in the New Testament that he offers in Jesus Christ through atonement. So in this lesson, we're going to refer to the punishments that we talked about in chapter 20 and the perfections that we talked about in chapters 21 and 22, which God imposed upon key persons in the Old Testament to just demonstrate the miraculous power of God, which reconciles these paradoxes or inconsistencies through Jesus Christ as the Son of God and as the Son of Man. Now, that's a mouthful. But what we're basically saying is that in the Old Testament, God appears to punish. In the New Testament, he appears to forgive and extend mercy. Let's look at the Old Testament and these punishments and look at how Jesus Christ reconciles the paradox or the inconsistency. The main message which I want you to receive from this lesson is that only Jesus manifests the power of God, which reconciles the paradox or apparent inconsistency between the punishments of God's judgment against sin in the Old Testament and the atonement of God's grace in the New Testament. The only person that can solve these inconsistencies, that resolves these inconsistencies, is Jesus Christ. It all points to Jesus as the only way. So we're going to talk about three examples or three paradoxes from the Old Testament. The paradox of the scepter of the king coming from the house of Judah, the paradox of the Messianic king coming from the descendants of David, the paradox of the perfections of the priesthood and the sacrifices, and then we'll have some discussion questions and wrap it up with some conclusions and applications. Well, let's talk about the paradox of the scepter of the Messianic king coming from the house of Judah. The Old Testament prophesies that the Messiah would come from the house of Judah. In chapter 49 of the book of Genesis, Jacob or Israel prophesied about the descendants of his sons. Prophesying about his fourth son, Judah, Jacob said, Judah, you are the one whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down to you. Judah, a lion's cub. With the prey, my son, you have gone high up the mountain. He stooped down, he crouched down like a lion, and like a lion who dares rouse him, the scepter of royalty shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh, another word for the Messiah, the peaceful one, comes. Okay, so there's a prophecy that through Judah that the Messiah is going to come. In the book of Zechariah, this is repeated. The prophet Zechariah prophesies about the Messiah, the cornerstone, descending from the house of Judah. In Zechariah 10, 3 through 4, it says, For the Lord of hosts has visited his flock on the house of Judah, the southern kingdom, and will make them like his beautiful and majestic horse in the battle. From them, Judah, shall come the cornerstone, which from the book of Isaiah is a reference to the Messiah. So what we have is a clear prophecy of God that says the Messiah is going to come from the house of Judah, from the descendants of Judah. Well, let's talk about Judah. His violation of Leviticus 20, chapter 20, verse 12, placed him under God's judgment against improper sexual activities and subjected him and Tamar, his daughter-in-law, to the penalty of death. Leviticus 20:12 states, if a man sleeps with his daughter-in-law, both of them must be put to death. What they have done is a perversion. Their blood will be on their own hands. In the book of Deuteronomy, God required those who violated this law to be cut off from his people for at least 10 generations. Now, although Judah and his daughter Tamar, the daughter-in-law Tamar, committed the sin before God pronounced these laws to Moses in the wilderness, Judah acknowledged that this was a detestable sin. When he found out that Tamar was pregnant, he said, burn her. the punishment that was the same punishment in Leviticus. A lot of these laws, even though they weren't promulgated, were still understood and practiced by those that preceded the descendants that were in the wilderness that actually received the law from Moses. The paradox or the inconsistency is if Judah and Tamar were both subject to God's judgment, could the scepter of the Messiah as king come from him? He's under punishment. He's defiled. 10 generations, he can't even go to the temple. How do we look at it? We look at Jesus Christ. In the genealogy of the lineage of Christ, we learn that Tamar bore twins, one of whom, Perez, became the father of the ancestors of David, and that David was the ancestor of Jesus. God, in his mercy, with the birth of Perez, carried on the promise of the prophecy for the Messiah to come through the line of Judah. And looking at the genealogy, it's interesting that there are 10 generations between Judah and David, so that when David became Judah's king, the 10 generational ban from worship had been lifted. The genealogy of Jesus resolves the inconsistency of the paradox. God, in his grace through Jesus, fulfilled the requirements of the law, the punishment for Judah's sin, yet allowed for the prophecy relating to Judah to be fulfilled. Only Jesus could fulfill that. Now let's look at another paradox relating to David becoming the king, and that was the punishment which God imposed upon King Saul for consulting with the witch of Endor. That's all covered in 1 Samuel chapter 28. The punishment in Leviticus chapter 20 for consulting a medium was punishable by death or being cut off. As we learned, despite being anointed by the prophet Samuel, David did not take matters into his own hand to kill King Saul to become the king. Instead, he waited upon God. Well, when Saul, and if you read 1 Samuel chapter 28, when Saul consulted the witch of Endor, and the witch came up, what did she tell Saul? Your sin will cut you off and your son's off from being king. And so the punishment of judgment was there. And so when by the punishment of God was meted out, but through the punishment of Saul, the pathway for David to become the king and the ruler of Judah and the ruler of Israel was opened up. So the inconsistency with respect to God's punishment and the fulfillment of the prophecies about the scepter of Judah was resolved by God's miraculous intervention in judgment when God punished Saul. Okay, now let's go to the paradox of the Messianic king coming from the descendants of David. In the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah prophesies that the Messianic king would come from David as a root of Jesse. In Isaiah 11:10, in that day, the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the people. The nations will rally to him, and his place of rest will be glorious. In that day, the Lord will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the remnant that is left of his people. We're talking about the Messiah coming the second time. But if we look at the history of Israel and the kings, as punishment for sacrificing his son to Molech in violation of Leviticus 20, verses 2 through 5, God punished King Manasseh, who descended from King David, by using the Babylonians to cut him off and his descendants from continuing the bloodship line of kingship. So Manasseh worshiped and sacrificed his son to Molech. And we see that in 2 Kings chapter 21, in the verses that I cite here, Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 55 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations that the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. Chapter 21. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced sorcery and divination, and consulted mediums and spiritists. The Lord said to his servants, the prophets, mainly Jeremiah, Manasseh, king of Judah, has committed these detestable sins. Therefore, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I'm going to bring such a disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle. the Babylonian captivity, the complete removal of the nation of Israel from Judah, the southern kingdom, all the God's punishment for the sin of worshiping Moloch and the other detestable sins that Manasseh committed. God then also told Joachim, the last king of Judah, who descended from King Manasseh, that none of his descendants would ever sit on the throne of David. Therefore, this is what the Lord says about Joachim, king of Judah. He will have no one to sit on the throne of David. His body will be thrown out and exposed to that heat by the day and the frost by night. I will punish him and his children and his attendants for their wickedness. That's from Jeremiah 36, verses 30, 31. The paradox is this. If God in his punishment cut off all of the King Joachim's descendants from ever sitting on the throne of David, how could a descendant of David ever become the Messianic king? You can't reconcile that. So, but if you go to the genealogy that Matthew presents in the first chapter of Matthew, it shows that Christ as a Messiah. Joseph, the husband of Mary, was a descendant of Jeconiah. Jeconiah or Coniah was the son of Josiah and the grandson of Manasseh. So what you had is Manasseh followed by his sons, but then the kingdom temporarily restored to Jeconiah, who was taken to Babylon and not killed. And through him, descendants continue to be carried forward the authority of the reign of the Messianic king. But Joseph was not the blood-related father of Jesus. Throughout the book of Matthew, Jesus is always referred to as Mary's son. He's the son of the Holy Spirit, Father the God. And so Joseph was not the blood son of David, and therefore no blood son of David ever was sat on the throne. The prophecy or the punishment was fulfilled, but God in his glory and his grace through Jesus Christ satisfied the requirements of a descendant of David, God the Father, the Son, but Joseph, the father by authority, allowing him to sit on the throne of David. So what we have is through the miraculous power of God, the pronounced judgment and punishment of David's natural descendants was fulfilled. But Jesus, as the son of Mary, not of Joseph, had the lineage authority to occupy David's throne, even though he was not a descendant by blood through Jesus. Again, Jesus reconciled the inconsistency or the paradox, fulfilling both the punishment imposed by God for the violation of God's laws given to his people in Leviticus, and at the same time fulfilling the prophecy of a descendant of David occupying the throne. You could go through the Old Testament and find many paradoxes. And the only way that all these different paradoxes could ever be reconciled or these inconsistencies resolved is through one person, and that is the Son of God, the Son of Man, Jesus Christ. Only Jesus could resolve all these paradoxes. We're going to get to the final paradox, and that's the perfections of the priesthoods and the sacrifice. In chapters 21 and 22, the book of Leviticus, God prescribes the perfections for the priests and for the animals offered to God as sacrifices. Both the priests and the animals offered in sacrifice were to be without defect and protected from being defiled or blemished by any uncleanliness. The paradox was, how could sinful priests repeatedly throughout Israel's history offer unblemished sacrifices in atonement when God's law required perfection in both the priests and the sacrifice? It really stated it a different way. If both the priests and sacrifices were perfect, then why did they have to repeat them over and over and over again? So the perfections which God required of the priests and the sacrifice in Leviticus chapters 21 and 22 were fulfilled by Jesus as the perfect, unblemished lamb sacrificed on the cross and raised as the perfect high priest to sit on the right hand of God. Only Jesus could satisfy the perfections required by God in Leviticus chapters 20 and 21 and 22. So that gets you into probably more head thought than you wanted to get into tonight. But the reality is that there isn't an inconsistency in the Old Testament. but it takes Jesus Christ to resolve all the inconsistencies and paradox. The word of God is true, completely true, and the promises, the punishments, the prophecies, and all of the other perfections that are part of the Old Testament and God's judgment are all fulfilled in the person and the deity of Jesus Christ our Lord. So now we're going to have these are pretty difficult discussion questions. I'll admit that. But the idea is let's get a discussion going. Conclusions: only Jesus Christ is the Son of God.